After the wildfire, a retired trapper in the Appalachians hears a thin cry in the ashes and carries home a bobcat kitten. Hiding it by the stove forces him to face the traps of his past, a poacher's fresh tracks, and a coming snowstorm. When he's caught in the very steel he once set, the wild little cat leads help to him. At dawn, he makes the hardest kind of love. He opens the gate and lets freedom walk. The mountains had gone quiet after the fire, as if the ridgelines themselves were catching their breath. Snow fell in a fine sift, softening the black scars where the flames had run downhill, licking through laurel and pine. Elias walked the old game trail because muscle memory took him there. Boots placed where they always had, hands brushing aside cold switchbacks of rhododendron, he moved like a man passing through a long closed room, careful not to disturb the dust. He had not checked a trap line in years, but his feet remembered where the snares used to hang and where the steel had once bitten down. He didn't look at those memories straight on. Instead, he watched the small things: the print of a crow's foot on a patch of wet ash, the pale ribs of a burned log, letting the rest slide past like water around a rock. The air smelled of rain, wood smoke that wasn't there anymore, and something faintly sweet from the charred sap. Near a bend where the trail pinched between a boulder and a lightning-struck oak, Elias paused. At first he thought he had imagined the sound, a thread of noise so thin it barely had weight. He took a breath and held it. There it was again, a tiny sawed-off cry. Not bird, not wind, not branch. Something alive. He stepped off the path. The snow was shallow here, a dusting over ash that slicked under his boots. He squatted, easing an old knee, and tilted his head to listen, like a man taking a confession. The sound came from a tangle of fallen limbs where the fire had made a nest of blackened sticks. He reached in and nudged aside a charred length of pine. The cry rose and then broke, a whisper of sound, the voice of something that had used up its last bit of courage. He saw a small body curled tight against a pocket of unburned leaves, no bigger than a pair of work gloves. Not a house cat. The face told him that at once, the short muzzle, the faint tuft of ear, the promise of spots beneath the soot. A bobcat kitten, fur singed at the tips, whiskers curled, eyes narrowed to slits against the cold. The little chest sawed up and down. When Elias slid his hands beneath it, the body was light as breath and hot with fear. He looked over his shoulder out of habit. No mother. No prints except his own, and a scatter of deer tracks stitched like careful needlework across the slope. The fire had moved fast through here. He could imagine the mother running, the kitten falling behind, the smoke, the confusion. Nature wrote such endings every day. He had lived by them once. He stood there too long, the kitten a small heat in his palms, the mountain air doing what winter air does, finding the cracks in a man's resolve. He told himself what men like him tell themselves: it's not your place, it's not your business, there are rules to this world, and you learned them the hard way. But another voice came up through those thoughts, tired but stubborn. It said there's a difference between leaving a life to the wild and leaving it to die. He shifted the kitten into the crook of his arm and straightened slowly. The little creature made a sound that could have been nothing at all, or could have been trust, and tucked its face against his sleeve, where the wool was still warm from his walk. Elias felt the old ache in his chest, the one that wasn't from age. He knew what bringing it home would mean. He knew what it would tempt in him and what it would demand. He also knew he was not going to set it back down. A glint caught his eye as he turned. Something under a drift, bright as a star where there should have been none. He nudged the snow aside with the toe of his boot. Steel. Not from the fire cruise. A jaw trap, oiled and clean, teeth like neat little smiles. Someone had set it recently. Ash smudged the chain where fingers had handled it. The chain ran back into the brush and was staked deep. The scene was careful, professional, not a boy's mistake, a man's habit. Elias's mouth went dry. He knew the make. He could tell you the weight by lifting it, the spring by how stiff the set bar felt in his hand. He didn't touch it. He stood very still, listening again, but now for something else. The sound of a person moving where a person ought not to be. Nothing. Just the filtered sigh of snow coming down through burned branches. He marked the place in his head the way woodsmen do, with 3 points in the distance: ridge, dead snag, the notch of a rock. And then he stepped back onto the trail. The kitten stirred and pressed closer. He tucked his coat around it and felt the small heartbeat against his ribs. He started down the slope toward the creek, where the water kept its own counsel under a skin of ice. Each footfall softened as he left the trap behind, but the knowledge of it stayed with him like a hand on his shoulder. The cabin waited in a fold of the hill, weathered boards and a tin roof that sang when it rained. Smoke would look natural there, but he hadn't lit the stove this morning. Now he imagined the feel of the iron warming, the kettle hissing, the slow thaw of his hands as he mixed goat's milk with water and held a bottle at the right angle. He could see it as clearly as if it had already happened. He also saw another picture: a ranger's truck on the road, a neighbor at the gate, an old trapper standing on the porch with a wild thing in his arms and a law he couldn't argue against. He walked anyway. The mountain didn't care. It never had. It held men like him, and it outlasted them. And if it loved them, it showed it in ways that looked a lot like indifference. Snow gathered on the brim of his hat and on the kitten's back where his coat didn't cover. He brushed it away with 2 fingers. The kitten blinked up at him, pupils narrow, a face that was not made for pleading and yet managed to ask. "You're all right," he said quietly, surprised to hear his voice in the open air. He had meant to think the words and keep them to himself. The sound of them made something loosen in him he had kept tied for a very long time. On the far ridge a crow called once, then again, as if announcing him. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He had seen enough steel for one morning. Someone was working these hills, someone who knew how to set a trap, so clean a man could miss it if he wanted to. Elias didn't miss such things. He had taught himself not to. By the time he reached the footbridge over the creek, the snow had thickened. He eased a hand to check the kitten's breath. It came steady now, faint but sure, washing warm against the back of his knuckles. He stepped onto the boards and felt the old wood flex. Water whispered under the ice, keeping its promise to move, even when everything else stood still. At the top of the last rise, his cabin showed itself through the trees. He stopped for a moment to listen to the quiet. The mountains took his answer and gave him none back. He tightened his coat around the small weight he carried and started down. A man who had made a choice and would have to live with it. Somewhere behind him, under the slow white hush, a set of teeth waited for whatever came next. The stove woke the cabin with a slow tick of heat, iron expanding like an old friend, loosening stiff joints. Elias worked by habit, steady and quiet, setting a kettle to steam and laying out a chipped mug, a small saucepan, and a clean rag. He eased the Bobcat kitten onto a folded towel near the hearth. In the morning light it looked even smaller, all angles and shadows, singed fur smudged by ash. It blinked at the glow of the fire and made that soft, breathy sound again, the one that wasn't quite a cry, more a note to say, "Still here." He warmed goat's milk and cut it with a touch of water, testing the temperature on the inside of his wrist like he'd seen done long ago in kitchens where babies fussed and women laughed him out of the room. He fashioned a makeshift nipple from rubber tubing and a cork he bored through with a nail, the sort of mountain ingenuity you don't name because it's either obvious or it isn't. When he held the bottle out, the kitten hesitated, then latched with an urgency that surprised him. It wasn't graceful. Milk dribbled onto its chin. Elias dabbed gently with the rag and remembered to breathe. "You're a stubborn one," he said, the way you talk to something too small to understand words but big enough to change a man. Stubborn meets stubborn. He fed it in slow pulls until the little belly lifted, warm and round. Then he set a shallow dish of water by the towel and watched the kitten nose it and look offended by the idea. He smiled despite himself. The cabin, with its quiet stacks of wood and the neat row of boots by the door, felt less like a museum of one man's habits and more like a place where time could pause and gather its strength. Around mid-morning, wagon wheels on gravel, no, tires on frozen ruts, stirred the air outside. Elias stiffened. The kitten's ears twitched. He cupped it in his hands and slid open the lid of an old cedar chest beside the hearth, its hinges whispering as if to keep his secret. Inside, blankets and a wool coat he hadn't worn since the last hard winter. He made a nest and set the kitten down. It blinked once and settled. He lowered the lid until only a finger's width of light remained and laid a folded scarf over the crack. A soft knock at the door, then another, and the familiar voice that always carried a smile. "Elias? You in there?" He opened to find Nora on the step, cheeks pinked by the cold, a scarf tucked neat under her coat collar. She held a small basket, eggs and a jar of apple butter, most likely, because Nora treated kindness like a routine rather than a performance. "I was headed by and thought your cupboards might want a little company," she said, looking past his shoulder the way neighbors do, not prying, just measuring the quiet. "My cupboards appreciate the thought," he said, and stepped aside. She set the basket on the table, untied the scarf from her hair, and breathed in the wood smoke. "Smells right in here," she said. "You keeping well?" "As well as a man can," he answered. It was the kind of exchange that covered most things without naming them. A small sound from the hearth, no more than the sigh of settling wood, unless you were listening for other kinds of sighs. Nora's eyes drifted toward the cedar chest. Just a flicker. She didn't move her head. "You hear the news?" she asked, as if the sound were nothing. "Harlan's been up and down the ridge since the fire. Says folks from off are nosing around. All kinds of tracks he can't account for." "I hear enough," Elias said. She kept her voice easy. "You be careful, all right? Coyotes have been bold in daylight, and not every man walking these woods means well." A crunch of tires again, more deliberate this time, and the low rumble of a truck coming to a stop. Nora tilted her head. "Speak of the devil, and he parks in your yard." Elias opened the door on a gust of cold air and saw Ranger Harlan climb down from his county truck, thick coat zipped to the chin, hat pulled low. Harlan moved like a man who respected his own knees. He waved once and came up the steps, stomping snow from his boots. "Morning, Nora, Elias," he said, nodding at each in turn. His eyes did the same neighborly sweep Nora's had, but longer and slower. "Fire's done its damage. Now comes the mess that follows." "Some messes never leave," Elias said. Harlan took off his gloves and warmed his hands near the stove, not asking and not needing to. "We've had reports," he said. "After a burn, animals push closer to people. Folks get soft-hearted or foolish, and that's when trouble starts. You see anything unusual? You call it in. That's the law and the sense of it." Elias felt the cedar chest behind him the way a man feels a splinter he can't show. "I see what I always see, trees learning to stand again," Harlan half smiled. "Poetry doesn't keep anyone out of court." He glanced at the mantel, at the tin cup where Elias kept screws, at the boots lined by size and years. He did not glance at the chest, which told Elias the man had noticed it already, and chose not to make a show. Nora lifted the basket's cloth and made a small fuss over the eggs. "You want a jar of apple butter for the road, Harlan?" "Wouldn't insult you by saying no," Harlan said, then turned back to Elias. "One more thing. We found a set of traps down past the lightning oak, fresh after the fire, not a kid's work. Whoever set 'em knows the metal." Elias met his eyes. "You have a name you're not saying." Harlan's look was careful. "I have a guess. Man used to run these ridges like they were his kitchen floor. Then he ran out of luck. Sometimes luck circles back." Elias kept his voice level. If you see Roy Henderson, you tell him not to step on my porch." Nora's head came up at the name, surprise running through her features, and gone again. Harlan didn't blink. "I'll tell him whatever the book allows. You tell me if you see him before I did." A sound from the cedar chest, soft as a breath catching on a dream. Nora looked at Elias fully this time. It wasn't accusation. It was concern wrapped in trust. Harlan turned his head a fraction, the way deer do when they sort the forest from the silence. "Rats," Elias said lightly, before either could ask. "They like to move into a man's memories if he leaves the lid open." "Set a trap," Harlan said. And for a second none of them missed the edge to the word. Then he pulled his gloves back on and nodded to Nora. "Leave that jar on the porch, and I'll pick it up on my way down. Elias, keep your door latched. If you hear something that doesn't belong to the mountain, call me." When the truck had gone and the sound fell back into the usual hush, Nora reached for her scarf. "He worries because that's his job," she said. "I worry because that's mine. You don't have to tell me anything. Just, if you're holding on to something, make sure it's for the right reason. And think about the day you'll have to let it go." He walked her to the step. The cold made their words show in the air like small promises. "Thank you for the eggs," he said. "Thank you for taking them," she replied, and smiled, the way people do when they've decided to trust you, even if they can't say why. Inside again, he lifted the scarf and raised the chest lid. Two gold eyes peered up at him. Calm now, a little milk drying on the whiskers. He scooped the kitten into the crook of his arm and listened to the steady beat of its breath. The law of the woods is simple, he thought. What you take, you owe. What you save, you're responsible for. He had broken his old oath at the creek and made a new one he hadn't yet spoken. He whispered it now, not to the mountain and not to any man, but to the small life against his heart. "I'll keep you safe as long as I can," he said. "And when I can't, I'll do the next right thing." Outside, the ridge held its silence. Deeper in the timber, where snow sifted through black branches, a patient mind was setting steel with practiced hands. Elias shut the chest for the last time and slid the bolt on the door, not to keep the world out, but to keep the choice he'd made from slipping away. Night settled deeper after the visit from Harlan and Nora, as if the ridge had drawn a thicker blanket over itself. Elias kept to a quiet routine, fire banked low, kettle warm, lamp trimmed. He fed the kitten by the clock and by the sound of its hunger, small paws kneading air while the bottle did its work. It learned his smell and the rhythm of his hands. When the heat from the stove went soft toward midnight, the kitten would nose under his flannel sleeve and fall asleep against the inside of his wrist, as if his pulse were a lullaby it recognized. He spoke to it the way men talk to the weather when no one's listening. He didn't plan to name it. Names made a thing belong to you, and he understood too well what belonging could cost. But the sound it made in the dark, barely a thread, a hush more than a voice, kept taking shape in his head until it felt less like a noise and more like a name waiting to be said. He tried it once in a half-whisper, feeling foolish. The kitten lifted its head and looked straight at him like it had been called. "Whisper," Elias said, properly this time, and the name settled in the room as neatly as a log placed just right on the fire. The days were short and careful. He cut kindling and stacked it in tight rows. He poured milk and wiped whiskers. He checked the window for tire tracks and the ridge for smoke. When he walked the small loop behind the cabin for exercise, he left no path to memorize, doubling back along his own prints so that the snow held only a tangle of the same story repeated. He kept the cedar chest open now and lined it with an old wool shirt. The kitten slept there in the glow from the hearth, climbing out when it pleased to bat clumsy at a knotted string he dragged across the floor. Some afternoons, when the wind moved down slope like a patient animal, memories came with it and set themselves in the chair across from him. He did not invite them, but he didn't send them away either. In those visits he was young again, lungs full of cold air, hands strong without thinking. He saw the old line of traps he'd once tended, steel cleaned to a shine that had felt like pride then, springs greased so quiet even conscience couldn't hear them. And there was Roy, the man who laughed easy and set iron like he was dealing cards, telling Elias that a man who hesitated would go hungry. Roy had not been a bad friend. That was the trouble with it. He was generous with coffee and winter stories and a spare set of gloves when yours were wet. And he believed in the straightforward arithmetic of the hills. What you caught was yours, what you missed went to the next man. Elias had borrowed that arithmetic when life felt like a ledger he could not balance. He had lived by it until the last time a trap held something that looked back at him like it knew his name. He had quit after that. Not loudly. One morning the steel stayed on the peg and never went out again. He told none of this to Whisper. He told it to the stove, to the knot in the table, to the part of himself that still needed to say it. The kitten learned the sound of his voice when it softened and when it stopped. It learned the cabin's map and the safe places Shadow drew at different times of day. It learned to stalk the dust motes that rose like minnows in a sunbeam, and to pounce with hindquarters too big for its plan. When it tumbled and startled itself, it would look over at Elias as if to ask whether the world had ended. He would shake his head, and the world would continue. On the third morning after Harlan's visit, Elias stepped out to split wood and found the yard quiet in the particular way that means you're being paid attention. The snow had settled in the night with a powdery hush. He studied it the way a reader studies a page. His own prints, yesterday's, had blown soft at the edges. A small set, rabbit most likely, had stitched between the chopped rounds and vanished under the porch. Then, near the corner of the cabin where the eaves dripped and polished the snow to a crust, something that wasn't quite right. A boot print, not his. He crouched, joints talking in their old language. The heel bite was shallow, the toe a hair wide. Someone had stepped there and then made a careful choice to step in older tracks where the yard ran thin with trample. A man who knew how to unsay his presence. Elias stood slow and let his eyes take the rest of it in the way woodsmen do, by not forcing the picture to appear. He caught the faint line of a path where a person had moved along the drip line to the woodpile, paused, and then gone back the way he came. He didn't call out. He didn't fetch his old shotgun from the hooks, because habit moved his hand that way, and habit was not the same as wisdom. He went inside and shut the door, and only then let the cold he'd been holding slip out of his chest in a long breath whisper, drowsy from. Breakfast blinked at him from the hearth and tipped onto its side in a sprawl that trusted the world. Elias slid the bolt and stood still, listening. The stove ticked. A small gust found the chink in the window putty and sang its thin note. Nothing else. Later he cleaned up after feeding and set a trap of a different sort, string tied to a row of tin lids along the porch rail, little bells by other names. If a foot came curious in the night, it would sing to him before it reached the door. He checked the lock on the shed and the shutter on the back window. He told himself that none of this was fear. A man tends his place as he would a wound, firm and without panic. That evening, when the ridge went purple and the trees turned to black lace against the sky, he took Whisper onto his lap and let the lamplight draw a small country around them. "There's a man out there who knows the metal," he said quietly. "Maybe he's tracking the same thing I am. Maybe he's tracking me." The kitten's ears turned at the tone rather than the words. Elias smoothed a thumb along one singed ear and felt the tiny muscle settle. "Whatever comes," he said, more to himself than to the animal, "we'll face it in daylight." When sleep finally took him, it brought the old road in dream form, the one that ran the spine of the mountain from Laurel Thicket to Rock Face and back again. Roy walked ahead, boots quick, carrying a canvas bag that clinked like winter. At a bend Elias knew too well, Roy laid a trap and said, easy as ever, hesitation is just hunger with manners. In the dream, Elias reached down to spring the trap and found his own glove in its jaws. He woke with his hand in a fist and the lamplight gone cool. He rose and went to the window. The moon made the snow glow from within. He stood until the cold of the glass soaked into his forehead and steadied whatever was racing in him. When he turned back, Whisper had climbed the cedar chest and was sitting tall, tail-wrapped, a small silhouette with a born hunter's patience. Elias smiled despite the hour. Some of us change by inches, he said softly. Some of us were born already knowing. He banked the stove and checked the tin lids on the porch one more time, then lay down with his boots at the ready, the way men do when a knock might come from something with a key or something with a silence. Before sleep took him again, he said the name once, to set it right in the room. Whisper. The little head tipped as if to answer. Outside, beyond the reach of the lamplight, a careful man's boot pressed a new story into the snow, and then, with practice, tried to erase it. By late winter the kitten had put on a layer of muscle and mischief, legs too long for its own plans, paws that promised what the animal would be someday. Whisper learned the cabin's rhythm, when the fire was fed, when the kettle sang, when sun pooled on the floorboards just right for a nap. Stalked the fringes of every rug, belly low, tail twitching, and made a ceremony of pouncing a knotted string as if it were dangerous. At dusk, when the world turned blue, it would sit on the windowsill and hold itself very still, the way wild things study the line between safety and a wider room. Elias adjusted with it. He swapped the little bottle for a shallow dish, cut the milk thinner as days went by, and mashed bits of meat with the back of a spoon so small teeth could practice without harm. He cleared a corner of the cabin and built a pen from old barn boards, a square of space with slats set close, more suggestion than prison. For your own good, he said, half to the animal and half to the part of himself that needed rules. When he latched the gate at night, Whisper pushed its nose through the gap and breathed in his sleeve as if to confirm the boundary was only wood. The world past the windows kept its own tally. Snow eased, then returned. Branches dropped their glassy weight in soft crashes from time to time. Elias walked his yard with a quiet purpose, checking the tin lids on the porch rail, brushing away tracks, and reading the night's news in the yard's frost. Twice, faintly, he found that same careful boot print near the woodpile and near the shed, as if a man had paused to take the cabin's measure and then moved on. The prints were the kind that made you think not of footsteps, but of intention. Nora came by with a loaf that smelled like winter spices and put her warm hand on Elias's arm when he tried to fuss with a plate. "I thought about what I said last time," she told him, eyes on the stove's small door. "About holding on and letting go. I didn't mean to sound like I was telling a man how to keep his own house." "You sounded like someone who knows how endings work," he said gently. She looked around the room with the practical gaze of someone who notices what belongs. "You've made this place soft without making it weak," she said, then added very softly, "Some bonds are ropes, some are ribbons. They look the same from a distance." Whisper, bold with company, stepped from the pen and came close enough to sniff Nora's bootlace. Nora didn't reach out. She let the animal decide what to make of her, the way good nurses and good neighbors do. "Well now," she murmured, "you're already your own person, aren't you?" Whisper blinked and returned to the square of sunlight it preferred in afternoons, a small ambassador from a nation that didn't believe in chairs. Later that week, a different knock, firm, official, not unkind. Elias opened the door to find Harlan with a young woman at his shoulder. She wore the same department patch and the same no-nonsense jacket, but there was a quickness to her eyes that made Elias think of river water. "Elias," Harlan said, "this is Maya. She's helping me watch the hills while things settle." Maya offered a gloved hand. "Good to meet you, sir. I grew up a couple counties over. My mother taught school. My father taught me not to trip on roots." Elias smiled in spite of himself. "Then you'll do all right up here." "We've had small sightings near home," Harlan said, getting to the point. "After a burn, animals test the edges. We want to make sure folks stay safe and that no one starts a habit that's hard to break. We'd like to set a camera or two, trail level, just to see what passes by at night." "Motion triggered," Maya added. "Infrared. Won't bother a soul except with the truth it collects." Truth can be a hard guest. Elias stood in the doorway and waited. If he said no, he said something else as well. He glanced at the corner where the pen stood and at the cedar chest now used for blankets instead of secrets. "Set your camera," he said finally. "Not on my porch, out there by the maple that lost half its crown." Maya nodded as if he'd passed a test she hoped he would. She and Harlan walked the yard with care. She pointed to a trunk near the path where scratch marks climbed like a child's handwriting. "Could be raccoon," she said. "Could be something with longer legs practicing its stretch." "Practicing," Elias repeated, feeling both pride and warning in the word. He kept his hands still. He kept his face empty of the smile that wanted to come. When they were done, Maya lingered by the woodpile, studying the ground. "I'm not here to jump to conclusions," she said, speaking low. "But I will be honest. If the camera catches anything that says someone made a pet of a wild thing, I'll have to act. Sometimes acting looks like advice. Sometimes it looks like paperwork. I can't choose that part until I see the picture." Elias met her eyes. "And if the picture says a man's trying to do the right thing the wrong way, then I'll try to steer him toward the right way," she said. "No heat, no shame, just the simple weight of a job put plainly. I don't like cages any more than the next person. I do like second chances." After they left, the cabin felt smaller, the pen larger. Whisper tested the slats, paws quiet, whiskers brushing the gaps, as if reading a story the wood had learned. That night, a mouse made a poor choice near the flower bin, and Whisper made a neat pounce that ended with no mess, only surprise and a small lesson learned. Elias praised the skill, not the kill, running a hand along the kitten's spine and feeling muscle knit under fur. "You're getting ready," he said. "Ready for the life that's not this one." He added a higher panel to the pen the next day, not because he mistrusted Whisper, but because trust without sense is the kind of love that breaks what it means to keep safe. He balanced the hammer in his hand and tried to name the thing he was building. It wasn't a prison, and it wasn't a promise. It was a threshold wearing boards. He drove the last nail and stood back. Whisper watched him from the corner with that old country patience cats are born knowing, tail wrapped, eyes thoughtful as coins. At dusk, a breeze came down from the high ridge, smelled of thaw and wet leaves and something green thinking about waking up. Elias opened the door and let the smell through the house. Whisper lifted its chin and tasted the air, the way wild hearts do when the bigger room calls. The little body went quiet, as if listening to a voice older than the cabin, older than the man, older than the rules that had felt like law to him until this winter. He closed the door gently and slid the latch. "Not yet," he said. "Not tonight." He wasn't sure whether he was talking to Whisper or to the part of himself that wanted to leave the latch undone. He banked the stove and checked the porch rail. The tin lids were still, their shine a kind of truce with the dark. Sleep took its time, idling in the hall like weather. When it came, it brought no traps and no roads, only the steady sound of an animal breathing in a wooden room and a man counting that sound as if it were prayer. Somewhere below the maple, a small red light. Each blinked at whatever moved between the trees, building the kind of truth that finds you even when you're quiet, the kind that asks only what you will do once you see it. By the time daylight found the cabin, a thin veil of thaw had turned the yard slick and shining. Elias dragged a length of twine across the floor, the knot at its end bumping along like a small, stubborn mouse. Whisper crouched, shoulders rolling, tail ticking at the tip. 1, 2, 3, and sprang. The knot skittered, the paws landed soft, and the kitten looked up as if expecting the room to applaud. "That's the idea," Elias said, easing the twine away and letting the game resume. "Learn to strike what won't strike back." He preferred this kind of lesson, the harmless rehearsal that taught a body to think before claws did. He set a tin cup on its side and looped the twine through the handle. Whisper stalked, tested, and swatted. The cup toppled, clinked, and rolled. The kitten gave chase, caught it, then paused, listening to the hollow sound with a seriousness that made Elias smile. A trap without teeth, he thought, a way to satisfy a hunger for skill without inviting blood into the room. Outside, the red light on Maya's trail camera would have winked when deer drifted past, or a fox tried the edge of the yard. Inside, a man and a young wild thing kept their lessons small and clean. Late morning, the stove hummed and the kettle sent up a soft white ribbon. Elias cut a bit of meat fine and mixed it with a spoonful of milk. Whisper ate with quick, neat bites, not greedy, not timid, learning to stop before the dish went dry. After, the kitten washed its face with both paws, eyes closing as if the world weren't worth seeing, until its whiskers were in order. Elias watched. That, too, dignity comes early to some creatures. He stepped out to split wood. Wind ran a hand through the maples. The sky had that damp pewter look that means weather's thinking. He set a round on the stump, raised the maul, and let the swing do what muscle memory asked. Wood opened along the grain with a single, satisfying report. He stacked, swung, and stacked again, letting the rhythm send yesterday's worry where work sends most of it, someplace simple. When the rack was full, he took the long way around the cabin to check the porch rail and the tin lids. No jingle, no sign. He let his eyes soften and read what the yard had to say. Fresh squirrels scribble by the steps, a cottontail stitching a neat path toward the hedgerow. Near the edge of the trees, where snow lingered in a pale patch, something else. He moved toward it slow, not to startle the picture before it was clear. There, in the damp leaf mold still dark from melt, a square of earth tamped flatter than what lay around it, a dusting of ash along a boot scuff. His gaze drifted a few feet farther and found the real thing, steel tucked under a spruce bough, snow brushed away clean, chain run back to a stake hidden under leaves. A jaw trap, oiled and ready. He didn't need to touch it to know the tension. The set bar lay easy, smug in its readiness. Whoever placed it had done so with the kind of care that looks like kindness until it closes. Elias stood very still. A meant thing radiates its meaning even in silence. He felt the cabin at his back like a body he could not shield with both arms at once. He took a breath, let it out, and spoke to the air so the words wouldn't sit heavy inside him. "You're not hunting, you're waiting." He followed the chain with his eyes to where it vanished, then marked the place in that old three-point way, snag, ridge notch, rock seam, and backed away the way he'd come, placing his feet in his own prints. Inside, Whisper was on the windowsill, eyes narrowed at something only cats can see. The tremor of a twig, the gossip of a wren, the longer room beyond the glass. Elias shut the door and set the latch. He brought the maul inside, not because wood needed splitting, but because having the handle in his palm steadied him. He went to the cupboard and took down a coil of wire and a pair of nippers. "We'll talk to Harlan," he told the room, "and we'll take care where we step." Afternoon brought Nora, boots muddy to the ankle, a pie balanced in a towel, the way country hands do. She read his face as if it were a weather map. "What is it?" she asked, not wasting time. "Steel at the tree line," he said. "Close." She breathed in through her nose and let it out slow. Then don't walk alone. And don't walk angry. I'll walk careful." He glanced toward the window. Whisper had dropped from the sill and was nosing the gap where the pen's gate latched, sniffing at the outside with a hunger that wasn't food. Nora followed his gaze. "You can love a wild thing," she said softly. "You just can't ask it to love your walls." Near sundown, Harlan's truck eased up the ruts, Maya at his side. They stepped out with the kind of quiet that means no one wants to spook anything. "We pulled a card from the camera," Maya said, voice even. "I wanted to show you before I said more." On the porch, she slid a small screen from her pocket and brought up the night's images. Deer fog-breathed and ghostly. A fox, sleek and undecided. A raccoon pausing, both hands busy with nothing. Then a frame that stopped the porch air. The angle was low, the yard glazed with moonlight, and in the center of it a small shape, ears tufted, tail short, spots bright as coins. The kitten paused mid-step, one paw lifted. Its eyes reflected two neat lanterns. Not a blur, not a rumor. A fact. Maya didn't push the screen closer or pull it away. She let Elias look as long as he needed. "I know what this means to you," she said quietly. "I also know what it means out here if we don't make a plan." Harlan's jaw worked once before he spoke. "We found sign of more traps up the north slope," he said. "Not a rash of them. A line. Whoever's setting them knows where to put pressure. Edges, crossings, the places a smart animal tries when it tests the world." Elias nodded once. "Roy's kind of work." Maya angled her head. "You know him." "I know the kind," Elias said. "The man, too." Silence held a moment, not empty, but full. Whisper pawed the gate and let out a sound that barely qualified as a mew, a little string pulled tight. Elias put a hand flat against the pen's top rail. "If I keep him, I lead him toward what waits. If I let him go wrong, I make him soft where he needs to be hard." "We can help," Maya said. "No cages if we can avoid it. Guidance, timing, a path that keeps him wild and keeps your porch from being the center of his map." Harlan tapped the railing with 2 fingers, thinking. "I'll run the ridge tonight, see what I can pull without leaving holes a man could fall into. You stay put till morning. And Elias, if you've got old iron hanging in that shed, now's the time to bring it to me, not to memory." Elias looked at the photo one more time, then at the cat behind the slats, then at the line where yard met woods. "I'll do what's right," he said. He meant it and felt what the meaning would cost. After they left, evening folded the cabin into itself. Whisper settled, but its ears kept taking messages from a place Elias couldn't hear. He sat by the stove and let the twine rest in his palm. Outside, somewhere near the spruce, Metal waited to finish a sentence someone else had started. Inside, a man considered the grammar of letting go and practiced, one last time, with a trap that had no teeth. The weather turned without ceremony, as it often does in the mountains, morning with a shy thaw, mid-afternoon with a steel edge, and by dusk a wind that sounded like a long, low note drawn from the ridge itself. Elias went room to room, checking latches, laying an extra log on the fire, tucking an old quilt along the bottom of the door where drafts like to test a man's patience. Whisper shadowed him, ears flicking at the strange, restless hush that comes just before a storm makes up its mind. Snow began as flour, fine and almost cheerful, then thickened until it drifted in visible lanes past the windows. Elias set a shallow dish for Whisper, a small comfort against the feeling that the world had leaned a little. "We'll ride it out," he said, more to steady his own hands than the cat. He added a second brace to the pen gate, a small insurance against surprise. Outside, the tin lids on the porch rail gave a nervous tremble and settled again. When the first real gust hit, it came down the chimney with a hollow boom that rattled the stove door. Whisper, startled, sprang to the windowsill and stared hard into the white. Something in that living, shifting wall called to a part of the animal that knew older rooms than a cabin could offer. The latch he had mended yesterday kissed the frame and jumped. A second gust bullied the window, and the small pane above the sash, already cobwebbed from years, gave up with a pop and a scatter of safe-sized shards. Snow rode the draft in, alive and cold. The sound split the evening. Whisper was on the sill, then at the gap, then gone. An arrow of spots and muscle into the white breath of the storm. Elias crossed the floor in 3 strides that still felt too slow, his hand catching air where a tail had been. "Whisper!" The name felt too small in his mouth for the weather to hear. He pulled his coat, jammed his hat down, and grabbed the flashlight and a length of line he kept by the door. He paused only to bank the stove enough not to starve while he was gone. Then he stepped into the night that was already erasing the day. Cold took his breath first, the particular bright kind that tastes like metal, and then the wind took the rest, pushing hard at his chest. He kept one gloved hand on the porch rail, then the edge of the cabin, then the maple trunk, moving the way blind men move when they know the furniture by touch. The beam from his light cut a short tunnel through the snow and made the world feel both close and near. He called again, the way a father calls without deciding that's what he is. No answer, unless you count the wind's habit of talking back in its own voice. He found tracks near the corner where the pane had failed, small, clean, already softening under the fresh fall. They ran toward the woodpile and then into the tangle beyond, choosing gaps between saplings with the native geometry of a wild thing. Elias followed, placing his boots as if he could think his way into pause. He did not hurry. He did not stop. "Steady," he told the night and meant himself. Beyond the yard, the world was a map drawn in white and remembered landmarks. He passed the stump where he split wood and the low boulder that always gathered a cap of snow, then angled toward the old path to the creek. The trees huddled together as if sharing a quiet secret. In the narrow places the wind dropped and left a soft, weighty silence in its wake. He could hear his breath and the small squeak snow makes under weight, human and otherwise. Halfway down to the creek, a new sound entered the storm's grammar, a cry that wasn't wind and wasn't the hinge whine of a tree. Short, sharp, then drawn out, the syllables of alarm pressed into an animal's throat. Elias answered without thinking, and the sound came again, nearer now, and to the left, where the ground began to forget it was a path, and tried the idea of being a slope. He turned that way, lifting his knees higher to keep his balance. The beam slid across spruce and snow, and the bright eyes of a thing that scuttled low and vanished. Then the world tightened. His right foot went out from under him on a patch of slick ash frozen under the new snow, and he dropped hard to one knee. His glove hit something cold and deliberate. Before the thought became a word, iron rose and closed with a flat, efficient clack around his left boot, just above the ankle. He knew the feel without needing the sight. Not the worst of them, not the biggest, but set careful and set right. Pain came clean, not theatrical, not merciful, radiating up the bone like heat moves through iron. He breathed through his teeth and said one old syllable he hadn't said in years, not a curse so much as a calling of the thing by its true name. He tried the chain. It ran back under snow to a stake driven deep. The work was practiced, the way habits get when a man has more time than conscience. Easy, he told himself. He eased his leg to take the pressure off the edge. The device had teeth, but not the cruel kind. Still, it bit, and every twitch argued with the metal's logic. He considered the options, measured by distance and time. He had a knife and a length of line, a flashlight with a battery he trusted, and weather that would not wait. He also had his age, and the fact that he had not told anyone where he was going because the part of him that used to tell had learned not to. The cry came again, this time from just beyond the lantern of his beam. He pivoted carefully, fighting the trap and the slope, and saw what his head had been trying to conjure since the window broke. Whisper. A small shadow in a big storm, body low, tail steady. The cat's ears were forward, eyes bright with effort. It made the sound again, but now there was something else in it, insistence, a line thrown from one living thing to another. Whisper approached, then stopped short, reading the iron the way mountain things do. It circled, sniffed, and lifted its face toward the dark above the trees, calling, again with a voice that seemed too large for its chest. "Go on," Elias said, not knowing if he meant go away or go get help or go be what you are. Whisper darted left, then right, then settled on a choice and disappeared into the combed white, between two firs. He could hear it for a while, branches shedding their snow in soft sloughs where it brushed past. And then he couldn't. He sat with the trap and the weather and the old sensible fear that visits when you have time to inventory the truth. Minutes stretch in winter. He tried the chain again, measured his strength against leverage, and counted to keep it neat. He breathed slow and let the storm make its racket. The cold climbed the leg the way ivy climbs a post, at its own pace, not to be bargained with. He wrapped the line around the trap's spring, set his boot against a root, and hauled. It gave a fraction, then stole it back. When the noise came, he almost mistook it for another trick of the wind, a faint tinkling that didn't match the forest's usual instruments. It resolved into the bright, familiar clatter of tin lids. Far off at first, his porch, he realized, his simple alarm, then another layer of sound from the ridge, higher and thinner, a whistle he did not own. He held his breath to sort the fragments and heard a third piece slip into place. An engine somewhere below, cautious on ruts, and a voice, carried thin by the cold, calling a name he wasn't sure was his. Whisper's cry answered from the dark, closer to the road than to him, insistent as a knock. Elias put his head back against the tree and let the storm lay a cold hand on his face. "All right," he said to the night, to the iron, to the part of himself that had been waiting. "All right." He tightened the scarf at his neck and set his hands again on the spring, ready to try once more, not because he trusted the metal to listen, but because help, if it was coming, had to find a man still in one piece. Above the wind and the rattle of lids, the small voice called again, threading a path through weather to lead someone who knew how to follow. The storm carried the sound like a messenger with orders, scattering it and then stitching it back together. The engine drew closer, cautious, and a second whistle answered the first. 2 notes, then 3 like a code. Elias held still and saved his strength for when it might count. He could taste iron and snow. The wind worried his hat brim and kept trying to take it. A beam parted the white with slow discipline. Elias! That was Harlan, steady as a fence post. Another light swung wide and then narrowed, more nimble. Maya's, he guessed, moving low to read the ground the way young eyes can. "Here!" Elias called, and the night caught the word and handed it along. They came on him deliberately, not with the panic that makes men clumsy. Harlan's light found the steel and stayed there, while Maya's found Elias's face. "You all right?" Harlan asked, not as a formality, but as a measurement. "I've been better," Elias said, and tried to make a joke of it. The joke didn't travel far. Maya took in the angle of his leg and the way the chain ran under the snow. "It's a clean set," she said quietly. "Clean doesn't mean kind." "Roy's hand," Elias answered before he could decide to hedge. The words came like a log eased onto coals, long overdue, a small relief and a small burn. He liked this bend, back when the season was different, and so was I. Harlan knelt and set his light so the metal's heart glowed clear. "We'll open it slow," he said, "on my count. Maya, line under the spring. Elias, you give me what you've got, and no heroics." They worked together the way experienced people do, no loud announcements, each hand finding its place. On 3, the jaws gave a grudging inch, then more. Maya kept the spring down with the line and reached in with a piece of wood she'd had the sense to bring, skimming the edge to keep the iron honest. Harlan let out a breath that fogged the beam. "There," he said, and the trap's mouth opened far enough for the boot to come free, leather scraped and dignity bruised, but bone still sound. Maya checked quickly, her gloved fingers competent. "You'll be sore," she said, "and I'd like a look at it when we're in light that doesn't blow sideways. But it's not broken." She wrapped the joint with a bandage from her pack, snug but not cruel, the way you'd hold a promise to a friend. "Can you stand?" "With help," Elias answered, and the truth of it didn't shame him. Harlan's arm was a solid bar. Maya steadied from the other side. They got him upright and kept him there while he found his balance. The wind fussed at all 3 of them, and then, as if satisfied that the point had been made, eased a notch. A small shape appeared between the firs, low and direct, snow on its whiskers like sugar. Whisper came close and then stopped where the light began, reading the scene with quick, careful glances. The young cat's chest lifted and fell fast. It had spent itself calling and running and calling again. It looked at Elias, then at the dark beyond, then back at Elias, a question and an answer inside one small body. "You brought them," Elias said, gratitude catching his voice on the way out. The cat's ears flicked at the tone, then angled toward the slope. It moved a few steps, looked back, moved again. Maya noticed first. "You have a guide," she said softly. "Let's follow while the tracks are clean." They moved as a slow, odd procession, Whisper threading the white, then Maya's light, then Harlan with his steady breath, then Elias leaning where he needed to and saving his words. The young cat kept a polite distance from the people, a small diplomat with pressing business. It took them downslope across the old path and toward a thicket where the wind dropped and the creek's dark ribbon made its own quiet. Whisper stopped under a leaning spruce and placed one paw, then another, very carefully on a patch of snow that didn't sag like the rest. The cat looked back at them and made a sound for the first time since leaving the cabin, a small serrated note that pulled attention the way a hand tugs a sleeve. Maya swept the beam and found it, another trap, just off the path a creature would take if it were learning the lay of the land. "There," she said, voice low, "and another beyond it." Her light jumped to the faint line of a third, a run, neatly set along a corridor of habit. The chain marks were crisp. Whoever had worked here had done so not long before the storm. Harlan crouched and brushed snow from the stake head. "Same hand," he said, "same rhythm." He set a small flag in the snow for the first trap, then another for the second. "We'll mark them and come back in daylight with the right tools. No use wrestling iron in a whiteout if we don't have to." Elias watched Whisper, who had stepped away from the iron and was sitting on a root, tail wrapped, the picture of a creature that understood both danger and direction. "He's learning faster than I did," Elias said. He felt the truth of that in his bones and in the bandage tight around his ankle. They made a small camp in the lee of the spruce, just enough to take the bite out of the night. Harlan struck a flame the way men do who have built 1,000 small fires and never bragged about any of them. Maya passed a thermos. The heat gathered them in, a little island of human stubbornness, and gave them permission to talk. Elias didn't make them tug. He told it plain, not to make himself look better or worse than the man he had been. How Roy had taught him efficiency, and how he had borrowed it because survival sometimes comes dressed like skill. How he had walked away without slamming the door, and how the door had creaked open now, when he found the kitten in the sash. He named the place where his lines had blurred and how the animal had walked a straight one beside him anyway. Maya listened with her whole face, a habit he recognized from teachers and nurses and game wardens who have decided not to turn hard even when the world offers them reasons. Harlan took it in without fidgeting, his only movements the practical ones. When Elias finished, the wind pressed at the spruce and let it go, as if to say that was enough for now. "You should be cited," Harlan said finally, not cruelly, simply measuring the law against the facts. He held the thought there long enough for it to mean something, then set it down. "But I've taken a tally of the night. You called something good out of yourself and gave us a line on a man who needs stopping. If you help us pull the rest of this iron and point us to Roy's habits, I'll call this a warning and put my signature under it." Elias nodded, the way a man does when a judgment lands fair. "I'll help," he said, "and I'll do what's right by the animal. No more secrets." Maya angled her head toward Whisper. "He did the bravest work tonight," she said. "Brave doesn't mean tame. It means smart with a heart in it. We can show him a path away from porches. You'll have to let him take it." "I know," Elias said, and he felt the knowing sit down beside him like an old friend who had finally remembered the address. They banked the small fire and rose. Whisper stood too, and led them back as surely as it had led them down, the way home written in small prints and memory. At the edge of the yard the wind lifted again, shaking the last white out of the maple's branches. The cat paused where the porch light made a warm pool and looked up at Elias. For a breath the world held still. "Thank you," Elias said, which was not a command and not a claim, only the truest words he had left. Whisper tipped its head and slipped into the shadow beyond the woodpile, a young wild thing with work still to do. Harlan saw Elias to the door and adjusted the scarf at his neck with a practical tug. "Daylight," he said. "We'll take the line apart, one honest step at a time." "And Roy?" Elias asked. Maya answered, her voice gentle but iron underneath. "If he's up there, we'll find him, and we'll finish this without making a mess we can't clean." Elias eased onto the chair by the stove while the kettle began its quiet talk. The cabin felt both smaller and cleaner, like a wound washed and bandaged. Outside, the storm busied itself with endings. Inside, a man and a young ranger and an old one agreed on what dawn would ask of them. Somewhere near the trees, two neat eyes watched the house for one more heartbeat and then turned toward the bigger room where a new trail was waiting to be made. Dawn came like a promise kept. The storm had scrubbed the ridge clean, leaving every branch edged in light and the creek stitched with thin lace. Harlan arrived before the kettle boiled, Maya right behind him, both wearing the look of people who slept near their boots. Elias eased his bandaged ankle into a boot that didn't want to help and met them on the porch. The air held that hush mountains keep after weather. Sound travels farther, words feel heavier. They started up the north slope, where the corridor of habit ran between spruce and maple. Harlan carried the tool roll. Maya carried flags and a small, neat coil of rope. Elias carried what he knew. Whisper ghosted the tree line, not close enough to make them forget what he was, not far enough to be mistaken for luck. The young cat stopped twice and studied the ground, then moved on, satisfied that it remembered what the night had taught. The first trap lay where they'd marked it, a thin frosting of new snow softening its edges. Harlan worked with the patience of a man who's removed more harm than he's caused, hand steady, jaw easy, no flourish. He slipped the iron into his pack the way you'd stow a story you intend to tell a judge. The second and third followed. "Neat sets," he murmured, which in his mouth wasn't admiration, just an accounting. By the fourth flag, tracks crossed the run, boot prints not yet softened, the heel bite sharp, the toe drifting wide in a way Elias had seen for years. They paused, boots angled for balance on the slope. Maya touched the edge of a print with a gloved finger. "He's working alone," she said, reading the uncompromised snow. "He's ahead, not far." Roy liked to check his line early, before men were coffee warm, Elias said. He heard the old knowledge in his voice and didn't hide from it. "He'll circle to the thicket above the creek. He always saved that for last." They moved quieter, not to sneak so much as to be decent. Whisper slowed too, tail low, head up. The thicket gathered them into a narrower world, branch, shadow, the faint talk of water under ice. Then a figure stood where the run met a small clearing, hat brim pulled down, coat scuffed, canvas bag slung in the old way. For a second the past and the present overlaid like two photographs in a dusty album. Then the man turned, and time did its job. "Roy," Elias said. No accusation, no welcome. Roy's eyes moved from Harlan's patch to Maya's careful stance to Elias's wrapped ankle. He smiled, quick and thin. "Always figured you'd end up a preacher, Elias. Didn't expect your church to wear badges." "You set steel after a burn," Harlan said calmly. "On public land, we pulled 4. That's 1 count for every jaw I've got in this pack. Hand me what's on your person, and we'll walk downhill like neighbors." Roy's gaze flicked to the edges. Men like him always carry a map of exits. He measured the distance to the creek, the distance to the next stand of cover, the distance to what he'd been, and found them all longer than they used to be. He took a breath that hardened his face and slipped the bag off his shoulder. The chain inside clinked, a small music with too many verses. "Nothing personal," he said to the air, to the years, to the choices that had led him to a morning where the light told the truth too cleanly to blame. He set the bag down. Maya stepped forward, voice steady. "Hands where I can see them, Mr. Henderson." She didn't raise her tone, because a raised tone is a kind of panic, and she didn't bring panic into rooms where she didn't find it. Roy obeyed, not because he wanted to, but because a part of him too stubborn to die still recognized sense when it stood right in front of him. Harlan did the rest the way a good man does hard tasks, without ceremony. "You're under arrest for illegal trapping and trespass," he said, reading the words plain so they'd hold up later. Roy didn't fight. He let his shoulders give an inch, a man who knew the ledger was due. Whisper watched from the thicket's edge, body still, eyes bright. When Roy's gaze slid that way, the cat didn't flinch. It simply held, as if certain that being seen didn't make it belong to anyone. Something in Roy's face changed. Surprise, yes. Then something else, a flash of the boy he'd been who once slept out just to hear owls arguing over nothing. It passed. He looked away. They walked downhill as planned, a line stitched back to the world that had brought them. Roy kept his eyes on the trail. Harlan kept his on the ground ahead. Maya kept her attention spread like a net. Elias walked in the quiet center of his own thoughts and measured each step against the person he'd tried to be since the morning in the ash. By noon, the iron lay in a lawful pile on Elias's porch, 4 from the run, 2 from farther up where Roy admitted he'd placed them, and 1 more that Harlan found by the logic of how men repeat themselves. The traps looked smaller in daylight and meaner for it. Harlan loaded Roy into the truck with the gentleness you reserve for old enemies and old friends, which in this part of the country are sometimes the same person. "We'll see you in town," he told Elias. "I'll write this clean." "Write mine clean, too," Elias said. "I waited too long to say the right things." Maya touched the brim of her hat. you're doing right now," she said. "That's what the day has yous for." When the truck's sound thinned and the ridge took back its usual quiet, Elias went to the shed and came out with a crate that had not seen light in years. He set it on the stump by the splitting block and opened it. Old traps he hadn't sold, not for any noble reason, just because some doors need a hinge if you ever want to look the past in the eye. He laid them out, craft, memory, mistake, and fetched the portable forge he used for mending tools. He fed it careful, and waited while the heart of it woke red. One by one, he warmed the jaws until the spring complained and the metal sighed. He pressed, bent, and opened them flat, the way you unteach a habit. The shape softened into something that didn't remember biting. He drew out a length of iron and worked it into a curve, then another, the hammer talking a steady, low language. From the softened metal he made a small bell, plain and true, its mouth round, its voice untested. He fashioned a clapper from a scrap of bar stock and hung the bell from a leather thong. When he lifted it, the weight felt right in his palm, the past accounted for, the future modest. He carried it to the tall pine by the porch, the one that had kept the cabin company longer than any neighbor. He tied the thong and let the bell hang where wind could find it and light could pick it out of the shade. For a long moment he did nothing but stand there, the way you stand in a doorway you have walked through 1,000 times, and finally notice. Beneath the maple, Whisper waited as if the day had been arranged with his schedule in mind. The young cat stepped into the open and stopped, eyes on Elias, ears forward, every muscle carrying the message of something that wanted two things at once. Elias knelt carefully and placed a hand on the boards. "You'll stay if I ask," he said, the truth gentle but exact. "But staying isn't your work." He didn't tighten the pen's latch. He didn't call. He simply opened the door that had been a promise and not a prison, and stepped aside. Whisper walked past him without brushing his leg, because that's how wild things say thank you. At the edge of the yard the cat paused and looked back with a stillness that held the whole ridge for the space of a breath. Then it turned and moved into the birch shade, spots blooming and fading as branches wrote their old script across its back. A breeze wandered down from the high ground, curious and polite. It found the bell and tested it. The sound that came was small and clear, not a warning, not a grief, just a note that said, "Present." Elias felt it in his ribs. He stood there until the breeze moved on to its next errand and the bell stilled. Then he went inside to set a kettle for 3 out of habit, before remembering there were only 2. He left the 3rd cup on the shelf anyway. Some habits you keep for the way they polish a room. Late light found the porch and warmed the chair where he liked to sit. The ridge threw its long blue across the creek. If there was a lesson here, it wasn't clever. It was plain. Some love holds tight and keeps. Some love opens a gate and stands watch as a shape grows smaller. Both kinds hurt, and both, done right, make a life honorable. When dusk gathered, the bell stirred once more, just enough to say the wind had returned from the bigger room. Elias looked up. He didn't see the cat. He didn't need to. The note hung in the air a beat longer than physics required, and then faded, leaving the old man and the old house and the mountain in their long, good company. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Before you scroll away, tell me this. Do you believe a bond like theirs could really exist? If this story touched your heart, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me, and don't forget to subscribe, because the next story might just remind you that sometimes the wild loves us back in ways we'll never forget.